Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this stream. Oops, let me move that. Yeah, so great to have you all here. So many people here, so many reactions already in the chat. That's amazing. Yet today you can see it. The topic is comparing React, Angular, and Vue, and we'll talk about it. I'm interested in hearing your views, your questions, of course. We'll maybe also build some apps to compare them. But yeah, I'll also share my perspective, and we'll just hang out and discuss these frameworks and everything that's related or not. And that's the idea. So yeah, hi to everybody who said hi. So many, as I said, so many nice reactions here. Already got one question: do people even use Vue nowadays? That's an important question. I'll get back to that. Started my GitHub Actions course. It's nice to hear that. Maybe someone here also took one of my courses. I got courses on all three: React, Angular, and Vue. So if you want to learn more about one of these frameworks, definitely check out those courses. The Angular course was fully updated for Angular Signals, which was the big change over the last years. I'll get back to that. The React course was updated for React 19. The Vue course is updated for Vue 3. So yeah, if you want to learn something there, definitely check out these courses. But enough for the advertisement. Let's dive in. React is fucking cancer, worst fucking decision of my entire life. Well, that's not good to hear. Svelte, I just read it. Svelte is missing here. Could add it. The main reason why Svelte is not included here is that I haven't worked with Svelte in a very long time. I mean, it's amazing from all I hear, just didn't have the time to work with it. So yeah, I'll try to do more with it, and then maybe that would be something for a stream too. Yeah, it's not included here for that reason. Do you think Angular and Vue will die only because React is AI default option? Yeah, that will also be important, and I'll get back to that. Why don't you try writing the code? Okay, so there's a question that I have many videos where I use AI to write code. Why don't I try writing the code myself? Well, I tried writing the code myself for the last over 20 years, and I still do to some extent, but AI is a useful tool, and as I explained in all my videos, and I don't want to turn this into an AI stream, by the way, but as I explained in all my videos, AI is an important tool, and I feel like I can be more productive by steering the AI, jumping in when I need to, and combining the best of both worlds. Yeah, okay. So wow, so many reactions. That's amazing. Let's dive in here, shall we? Now, as most of you probably know, React, of course, is the clear winner here if we just look at download numbers, and we can't do that. Here, the 10stack trends site is really nice for that. Allows us to compare npm download numbers. If we use React here, why is that version 18, by the way? Yeah, anyways, that is React. That's the React library. If we take a look at that over the last 5 years, what you can see, of course, is that there is a steep upward trend at the end, so since January 2025. And the clear reason, in my opinion, for that, of course, is that it is AI's default stack, and especially last year, we saw more and more use of agentic engineering tools like Cursor. More and more applications are being built with help of AI. We got services like Lovable, which generate apps in a vibe coding way, not my way, but a way. And React is the default for all these AI tools, essentially, or these AI models. As far as I know, it's also like baked into the system prompt of a lot of these tools to use React. So we can see that here. We see a clear upward trend, but even before, or upward trend is probably not enough. It's very steep. I mean, there was an upward trend for the last years too, but yeah, that's pretty great. Now, if we add Angular to the mix, the Angular core package, and I'm not sure why it showed a super old version here, but anyways, if we add Angular, ooh, that looks well, we got a clear winner, to put it like this. Now, important thing, at least that's something I heard a couple of years ago already, is that Angular is especially popular amongst some big enterprises, which might also have their own package repositories. So that may influence these numbers a bit. But then on the other hand, React is definitely also getting used by big enterprises. So yeah, it's definitely fair to say that Angular has significantly less downloads, obviously, than React. And if we add Vue to the mix, then we see there's this weird bump. We can ignore that, just an error. But we can see that Vue actually has more downloads than Angular. But from everything I hear, from everything I saw when I did research about job postings and so on, there definitely was more demand for Angular developers than Vue developers, from what I know. When I take a look at my courses about the sales there, I can also tell you that React and Angular are actually not that far apart, and definitely more than Vue. But yeah, here from the downloads, Vue is number 2 actually, for what it's worth. But both are of course significantly below the React library. By the way, of course, I'll try my best to keep up with the chat, and I'll scan it here and there. And I'll try to answer any questions or most of the questions. There's lots of activity, which is great, so I'll do my best. But yeah, please don't take it personal if I miss a question, because like talking, watching the screen, watching the questions and so on is pretty hard. And I'm no streaming professional like some other people. I do that just from time to time, but I enjoy it a lot. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Okay, so yeah, that's the download numbers. So of course, if we go back here, right? So if we take a look at the downloads, if that's maybe a metric we want to compare the usage, then of course React is like the clear winner, and then actually both Angular and Vue are almost equal and definitely behind that. Yeah, so what, just saw the question, what's my game plan going forward? Will you be making new courses and such? Yeah, definitely. I just released a new course yesterday, actually. So yeah, I'll definitely keep on creating courses on a broad variety of topics, some related to AI, some not. Yeah, so what else do we have here for React? And Next, in my opinion, has just gotten so messy and convoluted. Vue and Next is a great alternative. However, React is just so dominating. Better to start there. Yeah. That's the next point, actually. We see those download numbers, and we got a clear winner. So what if you want to find a job? I mean, I know finding a job is in general challenging these days, especially as a junior developer, because yeah, we've been at that peak during the pandemic, and now companies overhired. Now it looks way worse, and then of course we got all the AI concerns. So that is, there have been better days for getting a job as a junior, especially. No way of framing this any different. If you want to get a job, of course, you'll find most jobs most likely in the React space. Now I'm saying most likely because obviously that will always depend on where you are. There definitely are regions where one of the other frameworks may be more popular. For example, as I understand it, Angular is a bit more popular in Germany than it may be in some other countries. Not saying that React isn't more popular than Angular here too, but Angular in relation to other countries, to my knowledge, is a bit more popular in Germany. So when it comes to jobs, React obviously is pretty good, but Angular has some pretty big companies that use it too. Of course, Google would be a great example. They use it for all or probably most of their applications, as far as I know, also many internal applications. And Vue is probably the most niche solution here, but of course it can be a valid strategy to go for a framework like Vue, or to some extent also Angular, that may not see as much usage and therefore not as much competition as React. But of course, that's always a trade-off. Ultimately, I'll also say right away, in my opinion, if you learn one of them, switching and learning another one as well isn't too difficult, because, as we'll see, they have very similar concepts, even if they approach them differently. But I'll get back to that. What whiteboarding tool am I using here? That's actually my own tool, which I'm still building. It's not public yet. Yeah, but I hope to release it soon, and it will then be, you can then also use this local canvas for free. But yeah, right now it's just running on my system. I've worked with both Vue and React. From my perspective, Vue is easier to learn and helps you get started quickly, while React is powerful and really great. And a course on what did I release yesterday? I released a course on Claude Code. You can follow acadlink /Claude Code if you want. That takes you right to the course page. Yeah, and then coming back to that point about Vue being easier to learn, that's a good next metric, I would say. The ease of learning. Now, interestingly enough, that would have been even more important probably a few years ago, because of course now we have AI. And AI can, for one, of course, help with learning. And of course, it also can help with generating the code. Now, I've said it before in other streams and other videos. I find it very dangerous if you don't know something very well and you then start generating a bunch of code with AI, because then you're essentially vibe coding, or you're sliding into that vibe coding territory. If you don't understand the code that's being generated, you obviously can't really judge it, you can't really improve it, you will have a harder time working on it. And that's not something I like to do. So my recommendation would be, also for getting a job, by the way, that you still try to understand what you're working with, even if AI can generate some code. So to that degree, ease of learning still matters, but it definitely has changed a bit. And yeah, just because I see a comment here, there definitely are Vue jobs available. I'm not saying there are no jobs, just like if you take the download numbers as a proxy, and from what I saw when I did my research here and there, React has more jobs, but that does not mean that there are not enough jobs, or that there aren't many jobs for Vue 2, just to be clear about that. By the way, I can also already say I like all three frameworks, because I often get asked what my favorite is. I honestly like all three. I like all three. And of course you could say, yeah, because I got courses on all three, but it's the other way around. I got courses on all three because I like all three and I like working with all three. And I actually started my journey as a course creator with Angular, which was the first of the three I learned way back 10 years ago. But yeah, so there's that. Okay, yeah, ease of learning. That's an interesting one. Vue is definitely doing well here, but I will say it has gotten more complex with Vue 3. So if we take a look at the Vue documentation, you will see that there is a switch here. A switch that allows you to toggle between the Options API and the Composition API. And the, by the way, I don't hate Svelte. I explained why I don't include it here earlier. The Composition API is the default here in the docs. The Composition API means that you, in the end, use this kind of syntax for setting up some state, and then this syntax for incrementing it, and that is like a minimal component you could build. The Options API, if you switch to that, doesn't look that different, but there is an important difference, I would say. With the Composition API, you wrap everything in that setup function, though there is a way of getting rid of that. And you have this ref function here. With the Options API, you have a data function instead, and you have no wrapper around your state value. Now, the interesting thing is the Composition API essentially needs a build step to convert the code you write to code that can run in the browser. The Options API doesn't need that. Of course, this code would need it actually, but there are ways of getting started with just a CDN import. I'm not sure if they still have it in the docs actually. Yeah, they do. So you can use Vue from a CDN, and then just write code like this, and you need no build step, and that just works. Actually, I have to correct myself. That also is true for the composition API. I think it wasn't always the case. So yeah, a little bit of misinformation. Anyways, the deeper you dive into Vue, the deeper you dive into the composition API, which is the recommended way of using Vue with Vue free, by the way, the more complex it gets, but it stays simple. I just feel like the options API, which is that other way of using Vue, which was the only way of using Vue back then when you had Vue 2, was a bit easier to use, a bit more straightforward. That's just my personal feeling, though. And there are definitely maybe people that feel different. And to be very honest, the composition API is now the default for, I guess, 5 years. So it's not that hard. I'm just saying Vue, in my opinion, has been a bit easier to learn way back, like 7 years ago. But we're not living 7 years ago, and it's still fairly easy. It also has great documentation, I will say. So yeah, Vue, I would say, is definitely easy to learn, has some concepts that aren't too difficult to understand. And even though I feel like it was easier in the past, it's still all good, all simple. For Angular, it's interestingly enough quite the opposite. For Angular, they launched Signals a couple of years ago, which is a brand new way of managing state in there. And by the way, just to make sure we're all on the same page, all these frameworks are about building components that have state, which is in the end data you can change to then update the page because of that change. They can have props, which is data you can pass into components. Yeah, that's the core concepts essentially. And Angular, like Vue, actually has a concept called signals, though in Vue it's not called signals. There it's called refs when using the composition API, but that is in the end the same mechanism or a comparable mechanism under the hood. With Angular, it's called signals. And the interesting thing here, and I'll get back to the comments and questions in a second, by the way, no worries. The interesting thing about signals is that there was a lot of hype around signals like 2 years ago, roughly, I would say, also because of Solid.js, which is another framework you may know, which, like Svelte, is not included here, not because I hate it, just because I'm not using it as much. But Solid.js was relatively new, I guess 2-3 years ago, and they were the first framework to make that signal concept popular, even though, as mentioned, Vue used it before that already, but they didn't call it signal. So when Solid.js explained that they have signals and how they work, everybody was excited, and they started a signal hype that caused Angular to migrate to signals. Now, what's the interesting part about signals? The interesting part is that a signal is in the end a wrapper around a value. And then it gives you a function, a method you can call to update that value. And you can use that value in different parts of your application by calling a function. That depends on the different frameworks and what they do for you. But you can use that signal in different places of the app. And the framework kind of knows where you're using the signal. And if you then update the signal value, it can go to these places and update those parts of the DOM. And that can be very efficient. You might have come across the term fine-grained reactivity related to signals, and that's why there was a lot of hype around them. Now, React, for example, has a different approach. In React, as you might know, there you have the, where is it? In React, you have the concept of state. Where is state? No, this is not state. Managing state. Reacting to input with state. In React, you have the concept of state. Where is some state? Can I get some use state, please? Oh, okay, that's a step-by-step instruction of how we get to state, I guess. Yeah, so in React, you have use state, and that in the end gives you a function that can be used to update the state and a value that is the current value that's stored in the state. But when you update the state, React is not going to the place where you use the state. Instead, it will basically re-render the component in which the state was registered, so in which you used use state, and it will re-render the child components as well. So that's like a cascade going down the component tree. And that, of course, can lead to unnecessary re-render cycles. Now, to be fair, React has various mechanisms, like, for example, also the React compiler and stuff like that, that can help you, or that optimize the code behind the scenes to avoid unnecessary re-render cycles. And when I say re-render, I don't mean the DOM being updated over and over again. I mean the component functions being called over and over again, but React then derives the actual updates that should be applied to the DOM with a virtual DOM. So it's still super efficient, but it's a different mechanism. And this signal approach got quite some hype a few years ago. Okay, so that was a very long way of explaining that Angular changed. Because before the signal stuff, Angular had a different approach, and Angular was a bit clunky, you could say. And it's not just the signals. Over the years, the Angular team really worked hard to make Angular more approachable, simpler, you could say, to some degree, and a bit more intuitive, maybe. Now, Angular still has certain things people might not like, for example, classes, but I would say Angular got more approachable over the years. So I would have said, like 8 years ago, I would have said that across these three, it is the one that's the hardest to learn. Now I would say it's in the middle. It's more difficult than Vue, maybe, but also depends. You can have a different opinion, obviously. But I would say nowadays React kind of is the hardest to learn. And I'll explain. But first, let me catch up with the chat. Because I have a lot of messages. Laravel, great at React. Yeah, Laravel is a great framework too. My company has completely switched to AI. I'm being made to wipe code and not actually use my Angular knowledge. Yeah, being forced to wipe code is pretty bad. And I don't think a good strategy for any company, by the way. Could you please create a course covering topics such as bundlers, core, web vitals, SEO, best practices, security? Yeah, so that's a good point, by the way. I would love to do a more like foundational course where I dive into a lot of these foundational concepts. Can't promise it, but it is absolutely something I would like to do because I feel like it's more important than ever now in the age of AI, where we need to have strong foundations, strong fundamentals. I find Angular more structured, opinionated, that makes it easier to learn. Yeah, I'll get back to that point. Vue rocks. It's harder to make an Angular app crap. Yeah, possible. Also because it has more things included, but I'll also get back to that. Maintainability. I'll try to remember to talk about that for these frameworks. Could you please create a course covering? Yeah, we get that. Is there anything you can build in one of them and not in the other? That's a good question. No, you can build the same kind of applications with all three, definitely. Now, the follow-up is one significantly better than the others? And in general, of course, also no, but Angular has more stuff included, and I'll get back to that. And that can, of course, be helpful. But yeah, I'll get back to that. Have I jumped on the Clawbot or the Clawbot or Moldbot wagon yet? No, I have not. Maybe I'll play around with it a bit, but something's holding me back from setting up like my personal AI assistant. I like communicating with people myself and stuff, but yeah, I'll probably play around with it, and maybe I'll then be convinced. Does HTMX replace all the frameworks in the near future? HTMX is pretty cool, I will say. And I think for a decent amount of applications, HTMX, just like jQuery, to be honest, may be all you need. And I mean, I'm not using jQuery anymore, I'll be honest. I'll just feel like it's super easy to over-engineer and build everything with React just for the sake of it or just because we're used to it. And the same is true for Angular and Vue, of course. And actually, often you might be fine with just a nice backend and then a frontend that could just be using, for example, HTMX or vanilla JavaScript even for fetching some data and updating the DOM here and there, because not all applications need to be super interactive and entirely rendered on the client side. So I think that's a good point in general. It's easy to always reach for one of these frameworks when you actually don't necessarily need to, because especially vanilla.js also has come a long way, and I think we don't always need these frameworks for everything we're building. And that's also, I mean, we had the point earlier in the chat that Laravel is better than React. And for one, you can, of course, combine Laravel with React. But two, building a good old school server rendered application with just vanilla JavaScript or HTMX on the client side might go a long way for many situations. Also interesting, by the way, is Astro.js. I talked about this framework before in my stream. This is great for content heavy sites, for static sites, so that also can be a good choice there. We need a course on optimization. As I said, definitely want to do more about those important fundamentals. I thought React was easy. Yeah, I'll get back to why I think React is both easy and not easy in just a second. Okay. So why OnePlus for React? I'll be honest, learning React is not that hard, I would say. The documentation is decent. I think the documentation of Vue and also Angular is a bit better these days, but nothing wrong with that documentation here, for definitely. However, learning React is not that hard for sure. I mean, as I said, you just have a bunch of core concepts: components, props, state. That's like the base you need to learn for all these frameworks. And in React, a component is built by setting up a function. That function can receive props, so it always receives one parameter, one argument, and that is an object. And in that object, you can extract props, and it's up to you which props you want to get in which function or in which component, because it's your component. And then in addition, you can set up state inside of a component by using useState, the useState hook, which comes from the React library, of course. And as I said, state is a combination, or useState gives you an array where the first element is always the current value stored in its state, and the second element is always a function you can use to update the state. So that's, of course, not too difficult. However, what I think can get tricky about React is all the different ways you have of shooting yourself in the foot. Once you learn a bit more about the different hooks, once you learn a bit more about useEffect, and then you learn that you should not use useEffect all the time. I mean, there is this article about effects and useEffect, and somewhere in there, there also is a link to an article that you might not need useEffect. I'm not sure where it is, but it exists. Here, you might not need an effect. And then you got an entire article explaining why you don't need useEffect in many situations, which is important. You don't want to use useEffect all the time for everything, but that's the part that can be a bit trickier. Now, I'm not saying that Vue and Angular don't have their tricky parts. I'm just saying that this is some complexity that comes further down the line, where I feel like Vue and Angular maybe have a bit less of that complexity. And obviously, you may absolutely disagree there. It just feels a bit like with Vue and Angular, it's a bit more straightforward to solve certain problems. But yeah, that's just my feeling from working a lot with React over the last months, and in general, of course, also Angular and Vue. You can definitely judge this in a totally different way if you want, but that's just my take on that. But ultimately, all three, of course, can be learned, and with all three, AI can help. By the way, if you're using AI for generating code with React, you will get lots of UseEffect usage and lots of places or lots of code snippets where UseEffect is used where you would not need it. And by the way, I've also never been a fan of, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there were lots of discussions on X and so on, and you know the internet, where it felt almost like a crime if you used UseEffect anywhere in your code. And yeah, obviously, you want to try to write clean code. You want to follow best practices. Absolutely, they exist for a reason. But yeah, if you reach the point where you're afraid to use a certain library because you might be doing it wrong, that's too much. So, anyways, yeah, that's the ease of learning. Now, we had another interesting point before in the chat that we could compare. Oh yeah, that's the batteries included part. So, what's included, or let's name it batteries included. Question mark. And what do I mean with that point? Here, I simply mean what's inside of that framework by default. For example, with Angular, there's a lot inside of Angular. If we take a look at the Angular documentation, we can see we got dependency injection in there. Now, what is dependency injection? That means that, well, that's also an architectural thing, of course, with Angular. But the idea behind Angular is that if you got some logic that is maybe a bit more complex or that affects multiple components, you don't want to put it into component functions necessarily. Instead, you create services, which are in the end just classes that contain some, you guessed it, logic. And these classes can then be injected into other places, into components, for example, with help of the inject function, also with help of the constructor function, but inject is the more modern approach. And that means that in that other class, in that component class, you have access to that service, and Angular will make sure that the service get instantiated, that one instance is used, so one and the same instance is used across multiple components so that they are acting on the same data. And that, of course, is very useful. That's one nice convenience feature you get. Obviously, React would have its context feature for sharing state across components. In Angular, you also have directives, which are some attributes, for example, you can add to components or to elements actually to change their behavior. So you don't need to create a component for everything. You can build your custom attributes, for example. So that's also nice. But even more importantly, the Angular framework itself comes with built-in routing. So it has everything you need to set up routes for your single page application, to load different components for different URL paths, for loading data, for fetching data for those routes. It comes with built-in forms support so that it can help you with setting up forms and with handling form submissions, extracting submitted data, and so on. So it has all that, and it has different ways of defining forms. It has signal forms, reactive forms, and template-driven forms, where reactive and template-driven forms are the two approaches that have been around forever, basically, and signal forms is a new approach, which is still experimental, so not production-ready. We also have an HTTP client here, which helps you with sending HTTP requests. So you get my point. You get my point. There is a lot of stuff included in Angular. And for React, for example, and also for Vue, but well, for Vue it's a bit different. But for React, nothing of that is included. If you want routing with React, you need to add an extra library like React Router or TanStack Router. And that's not maintained by the React team, which of course means if the people that work on React Router decide they don't want to do that anymore, you need a new library or you need to maintain it yourself, whatever. Obviously, there also are advantages by the community doing that instead of the official team, because different approaches can become popular. updates, for example, in Angular are tied to the major updates of the framework, which happen every 6 months. A standalone library like React Router can be updated independent from the React versions. So there are advantages, but there also are disadvantages by not having it included in the framework or library. And that's also, by the way, why it's super important for certain people to emphasize that React is a library and not a framework, not just because of that, but also because it has essentially no batteries included or only a very small amount of batteries. For Vue, it's 3 or 2 pluses here, because Vue itself does not have routing or anything like that, but Vue has a router that is in the end maintained by people that are part of the core Vue team. So you get these extra packages which are not maintained by totally independent people, but by people that kind of belong to the core Vue team. So therefore they are in line with the core Vue philosophy, and there's a bit more guarantee that they will be maintained in the future too. By the way, just to be very clear, React Router has been around for forever essentially and is well maintained. I'm just making a general point here. So that's what I mean with batteries included. Angular has more stuff included. Angular has more stuff included here than Vue and React, for example. Okay, let me catch up with the chat again. Angular paid me my house. Wow, that is pretty cool. I love Svelte. Why did I not include it? I have nothing against Svelte. I just haven't worked a lot with Svelte, so I would not be that qualified to judge it or share a lot of knowledge about it. I said it before, Svelte might be something I want to explore in a stream because I have worked before with it, of course, but I haven't worked with it at all in 2 years or so. So revisiting Svelte in a stream might be interesting. Isn't Angular a framework like Next? No, actually not. Next.js, obviously a meta framework, a full stack framework for React, and that's a nice next category. Full stack frameworks, because that might also be an important decision point. React has Next.js. Next.js is a meta framework, which means it is a framework on top of another framework or library. It builds up on React, it uses React, and it's a full stack framework. So with Next.js, you can build full stack applications. With just React, just as with just Angular and just Vue, you build single page applications because these are frameworks and libraries that run on the client side in the browser. So you can build single page applications with them by default, but not full stack. Now, important, you can actually add server-side rendering. So Angular has support for server-side rendering. Here we go. But that's not the same as a full stack framework. That's only part of the story. But Angular has built-in support for rendering components on the server side as requests are coming in, and then sending back that rendered HTML page to the client, and then it hydrates that, so it makes it interactive and it turns it into a single page application again, but the initial page is rendered on the server. Angular has built-in support for that. For Vue, I have to admit, I wasn't sure, but I thought it had it too, and it does. And React also has server-side rendering support. It just requires a bit more work to set it up. I'm not sure. Where are the docs? That's something else. Server components is something else. Yeah, so server-side rendering is a bit more work with React. And less so with Vue and Angular, which have better support for it. But either way, it's not the same as a full stack application, because a full stack application is not just about rendering that first page on the server and sending it back. It's also about handling form submissions, for example, or HTTP requests sent from the client side and then updating a component based on that, or returning a new page based on that. It's about more than just the initial request. So that's where Next.js comes into play, because that is exactly that kind of framework. It adds all those server capabilities you would want. It also helps with caching. Can take it a bit too far, but that got better over the years, and that makes it easy to build full stack applications that leverage React. Now, Angular also has a meta framework called Analog.js, but I will be honest, I have not used Analog.js at all. And I don't know how good or how popular it is. It is well maintained, absolutely, actively maintained, as you can see, but only has like 3,000 stars. Yeah, which is a bit sad, which is honestly a bit sad. Not sure why. Maybe just because Analog.js was added or was released way later than Next.js or Next, to which I'll get back for Vue. I don't know why, but yeah, it exists, but it's definitely less used, way less used than Next.js. But Analog.js, like Next.js, also handles the server-side rendering part, but it also helps with data fetching, so that you can fetch data attached to a component, so to say, so that the finished component with all the data it needs is sent to the client side. And it also has support for form actions, which means that form submissions can be handled on the server side, so that you can store the data in a database there, something Next.js also does. And then there is Next.js. Next.js is the full stack Vue framework, as you can see. So let's add that here. Next.js. Here we go. And same story. It's a full stack framework, but it works a bit differently as far as I know. And feel free to correct me if there's something I get wrong. But as I understand it, it does help with data fetching and with populating components with data that has been fetched on the server, so that the component can be rendered on the server with data. But when it comes to data mutations, so to data changing, my understanding, and it definitely was like this in the past, my understanding is that you need to do that with API routes, and you send a request from the client side to that API route, and then that can trigger an update in a component. So you can build those full stack applications with it, but you don't have that tight integration of client side and server side, which you do get with Next.js and Analog.js, as it seems. Because in Next.js, you can call a function that is set up as a server function, and you call that from inside your component, and to you, it looks like that's being called on the client, but behind the scenes, actually an HTTP request is sent to the server side for you. That, of course, can be very convenient. With Next, you do that manually, so to say. You set up the backend API route on your own, you send that HTTP request on your own. Yeah. React has baggage included, okay. Would be a good idea to also compare those frameworks regarding rendering options like multi-page application, single page, server-side rendering, server-side generation, incremental static regeneration, and so on. Yeah. We'll see how technical I want to get here, but I get the point, yeah. Alpine.js also pretty good for just some sprinkles of JavaScript. Updating the mean course is not planned right now, sorry. Are all these frameworks for SPA mainly? Yes, these three are for SPA, unless you use one of these full stack frameworks. Okay, so I think I covered that. Is it important to learn meta frameworks for the job market? It doesn't hurt. It definitely doesn't hurt, and I think it's the logical next step if you learned the base framework or library. I mean, with React, you could also go for React Native if you want to build mobile applications. But other than that, I think learning a meta framework, a full stack framework like Next.js makes a lot of sense. Okay. Could you explain why NGRX could be useful as a store for Angular? When I can, for example, make my own store service? Yeah, okay, that's a good question. NGRX, I don't want to dive too deeply into it because I don't want to turn this into an Angular stream. NGRX is an extra library that's not by the Angular team. I think maybe it's maintained by parts of the Angular team, but the idea behind NGRX is that it can help with complex state management. Now, I think it's important to understand that NGRX comes from a time when we were still using Redux for state management in React applications. Now, in case you don't know, you don't need to learn it these days anymore. Oh, that's a bit too harsh. But it has definitely seen more use, I would say. Redux is a library that can help with state management in Angular, in React components. And you will definitely see it being used out there. Definitely also still a lot. I should not frame it as if it's not being used anymore. I'm just saying Redux was especially popular, I would say, in 2017, 18, 19. And we needed all those state management frameworks back then. Since then, more and more state management capabilities have been added to the libraries, like React got the context feature, which was revamped back in 2017 or 18 so that it could manage state across multiple components a bit easier. And now, of course, with the meta frameworks, we also manage a bit more state on the server if you're using such a meta framework. If you're not using it, if you're building a single page application, you still frequently have the problem that you have certain state that affects multiple components, and you might not want to use React context for that. Because if you update something there, all the components wrapped by it might be updated. So then you could reach for something like Redux, or in case of Angular, NGRX. But with Angular, as was correctly stated, you could also create a service class and use that for shared state, which is indeed what it's intended for. So NGRX, long story short, is really, in my opinion, a library which you only need in niche situations when you're building super complex applications with complex state that can change in a broad variety of ways from a lot of different components. Then you can end up with a cleaner architecture if you have clearly defined actions and reducers, and that's what NGRX is about in the end, with NGRX. And it also supports signals, so you can also set up such a global signal store. And again, if you're building a really complex application, then NGRX can simplify state management. If you're working on your own or in a small team, and if you're fine with using service classes, stick to it. You don't need to use NGRX, but yeah, it's there if you need it. Okay, that's the long explanation, I guess. What else do we have? How about testing? Yeah, I can come back to that. What did you use for building that editor? This editor here is built in React, actually. And 10-stack start. Not sure what you mean. You do not need the Next API route. Next re-renders components on prop changes automatically. No, I don't mean prop change. If you have like a form submission, or if a user changes something, you need to store that data in the database, for example. Then you need to communicate that data change from the client side to the server side. And my understanding is that you do that with help of API routes. I see no data mutation state here. I understand that there is a page here. I understand that there is state that can be shared between server and client side. But my point just is that I don't know if Next has a concept equivalent to server actions. but I might be wrong. Maybe it's something like this event handler thing here. But then again, that's in the API, right? That's an API route. That's just what I mean. It's a separate route which you trigger through an HTTP request. And there's nothing wrong with it. Just want to be very clear. Not saying that this is bad or anything like that. Just saying that to my understanding, there is no equivalent or no direct equivalent to server functions, which we have, for example, in Next. That's my only point here. But again, does not mean that this is bad or anything like this. Do frameworks in comparison to web components and vanilla.js have too much bundle size? Yeah, of course, when you're using like a framework here, you definitely end up with bigger bundle sizes, especially compared to vanilla.js. That is a trade-off you have. You get more functionality. Writing the code can be a bit more convenient and easier because you don't need to implement everything from the ground up. And especially if you're building more complex applications, you don't end up with a bunch of imperative code where you might end up with spaghetti code, but you pay for that with bigger bundle sizes. On the other hand, of course, if you're building a complex application with just vanilla JavaScript, you'll need a decent amount of code too, which will also give you a decent bundle. But always less than if you bring in an entire extra framework or library. I know all core HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, MySQL. I haven't done any frameworks. What's your recommendation? A good full stack roadmap to follow in 2026. Yeah, my recommendation would indeed be to pick up one of these frameworks and learn a bit more about that. And then also a meta framework as a next step to be able to build full stack applications with that if you already have the HTML and so on essentials. Using useState or Pinya, changing a value in store will result in an update behavior in all components. Yeah, I know. I absolutely know about that. I was just referring to the full stack part on the server side. If I want to store something in a database, I'm not talking about state updates. I absolutely know that you can obviously do cross-component state updates with Vue. I was referring to the full stack part. Okay. No, I did not fork Excalitraw. It's built from the ground up with the Canvas API, with React and so on. So that's the editor. It's not a fork of anything. Okay. Got it, the Hodrick. Yeah, I got it. So that's basically what my understanding was about Next. And obviously, therefore, as I said, you can, of course, update data on the server side. It's just not that this server function feature exists necessarily. But on the other hand, it's all, of course, it comes down to personal preference if you want that or not. And there's, as I said, nothing wrong with API routes or anything like that. There was a question about testing. That's a nice thing with the batteries included. Angular has built-in support for unit tests and so on, has its own test bed. Vue also has built-in support for or official support, you could say, but besides the Vue test utils, they also reference the testing library here, and that is what I would recommend anyways when you're doing unit testing. Testing library is a pretty amazing third-party library you can use, which supports, which supports React, Vue, Angular. I mean, you see it. And for React, by the way, that is the officially recommended, I think, solution. Definitely the one I always use, which really helps a lot with building or with writing unit tests. And of course, nowadays, you can, of course, also use AI to generate some tests for you. But yeah, testing is built into Angular, and you use third-party tools for React and for Vue probably too. Okay, so what else would be a good metric to compare these or to share my opinion on here. We can definitely also have a look at some code or try to build something. I just want to not miss anything obvious that might be interesting to mention here. Why unit testing and why not step right into E2E testing? I think you should do both. I always do both. For E2E testing, my go-to is Playwright, though I will say Cypress is another popular option. These are great tools for end-to-end testing, and I would always recommend to do both. And especially, again, if you're using, I would do it no matter if you use AI or not, but if you're using AI, the advantage of having tests, of course, also is that AI tools like Claude Code can call or execute those tests and use them to validate their changes, which is a nice feedback loop. But either way, if using AI or not, I would always write both unit and end-to-end tests. Metric of what batteries are available in the NPM ecosystem. Well, I think in the end, the important part is full stack frameworks, which I already have. And then it would be routing, where we, of course, have the awesome React router and TanStack router. So we got that here. Here for Angular, we got the official Angular router. And for Vue, we got the kind of official, or yeah, the official Vue router. So that's that. And what else do we have? Whoops. I think we also, oh, I should zoom out a bit. I think we also have state management libraries. So that would be for React, could be Redux, could be something like Zustand, which is a nice German word, which is pretty popular these days. For Angular, you either use the built-in services, or as mentioned, you use NGRX if it's getting super complex. And for Vue, you could use Pinya. I always forget how it's written. Is it written like this? Pinya? Yeah, it's written like this. So you could use that here for cross-component state management, essentially. Yeah. Do I consider it best practice to execute database queries directly within Next.js server functions instead of doing it using server endpoints? Best practice, I would say it comes down to personal preferences, but the official recommendation with Next.js definitely is to use server functions. So if you take a look at the Next.js documentation, you will see that there, under updating data, which is in the end storing data, you get introduced to server functions. So yeah, I would use server functions when using the app router, when using the pages router, of course, which you can still use. I would use API routes, but yeah, for the app router, I would use server functions. Do we have a library for Angular like TanStack Query for React? TanStack Query actually has Angular support as far as I know. Whoops. It has a Vue and Angular version as well. So you can use TanStack Query with Angular if you want. But I should do that. I should actually play around with that, I think. I haven't used it before. I always use the official Angular HTTP client since it's baked in and kind of the official thing. But yeah, I should probably play around with that and see if it's as good as it is for React. What's my thoughts about MERN and mean stack? I think the problem with mean, which is an Angular thing, of course, and MERN is probably the M. Now, in case you don't know, which is absolutely fine, that stands for MongoDB, and then Express, and then React, and then Node.js. And for Angular, the React is of course replaced, so the A stands for Angular. So yeah, Express is still super popular. Obviously, these days, instead of Node.js, Bun has some advantages, but Node.js is still like the number one if you look at usage numbers. But I personally prefer Bun, for example, but that's an easy swap. And instead of Express, you could use something like Hono if you're working with Bun, which is a bit of a more modern framework. But then again, Express.js got version 5, I think it was. Let me see. Express.js GitHub. Express, yeah, version 5. So like there was no new version for, I don't know, 5 years. And then last year we finally got version 5. Anyways, so Express.js and Node still a good choice, but you could replace them. MongoDB also still a good choice, but from everything I read and what it feels like, there was lots of hype around MongoDB in 2017 to 20. And nowadays, I feel like that's not the case anymore. There's more hype around Postgres maybe, about Convex these days, about Supabase, which is in the end just a Firebase alternative that uses Postgres internally. So I feel like these are more popular these days for database solutions, though I will also say Supabase, it's not really a database. And Convex is also more than just a database. But for all these reasons, I think Mern and Mean are still good choices, and you'll still find jobs on them. But the hype days, I would say, are over. If that's good or bad is, of course, a different debate. Yeah. Do you think Sass and SCSS still have the right to exist since vanilla CSS has become so mighty the last years? I personally don't need Sass anymore. Vanilla CSS has native nesting, has custom properties, has relative colors. I don't see where I would need Sass anymore. There definitely still are some features or some things you can only do with Sass that you can't do with vanilla CSS, but I just don't use these features, so I don't need Sass. So for me, it's a clear no, I don't need Sass anymore. Vendor login is interesting. Yeah, vendor login, security. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk vendor login, which of course means if you use one of these libraries, how easy is it to get out of it? How easy is it to switch? I think, well, how do you approach this? Ultimately, you're kind of locked in with all three because you'll always have to rewrite your entire front-end code if you switch to another framework. If you want to switch from React to Angular, you got to rewrite everything there. Obviously, if you're using something like Next.js, you even have to rewrite your backend if you're switching. And that's true for Analog and Next.js too, which might be one reason, by the way, why you might want to go for a decoupled single page application and then a backend API that could be Node with Express or Bun and Hono or anything else. So I think that's maybe the more interesting angle, because regarding vendor lock-in, let's say 1+ means that there is a decent amount of lock-in. I guess you have that with all three frameworks per definition, kind of. Yeah, but when you look at it from a full stack perspective, you will also have that with all three, but that might be a reason to not use these full stack frameworks if you don't want to. Oh, by the way, regarding the full stack frameworks, what a plunder. Of course, you also have TanStack Start here, and also React Router has a full stack framework variant, so to say. That is definitely important to mention here as well. And from that perspective, maybe you could say with React, you have more options. If you want to build a full stack Vue application, you got two main options. The first option is that you build a front-end single-page application with Vue, and then a decoupled backend REST API. And for that REST API, you can use whatever you want. It doesn't have to be JavaScript at all. It could be C# and .NET, could be Java, could be anything. or you use one of the official or the only kind of official full stack framework in case of Vue, which is Next. And in Angular case, it's Analog. And with React, you actually have options. So React Router, as I mentioned, also can be used as a full stack framework, so can Next.js and 10-stack Start. Now, switching from one of the other will take some effort, but you can keep on using React. And that might be a big point here. So I think there's less vendor lock-in when building full stack applications, when using one of these frameworks, when working with React, because you can switch the framework and keep on using React, if that makes sense. Another interesting metric before I get back to security, by the way, could be if you're interested in building mobile apps, that is, of course, great with React, because there is React Native, which is amazing, which has seen lots of love over the last years, which has developed really, really well, and you can build awesome apps with it. With Angular and Vue, I'm not sure if it's 1 or 2 pluses, because there is NativeScript. There is NativeScript, and I have to say NativeScript is just amazing. NativeScript is just amazing because NativeScript has been around forever, for a very long time. I recall watching an Angular conference back in 2016, and the NativeScript team was talking about NativeScript with Angular. And NativeScript, in case you don't know, is like React Native for Angular and Vue, and I think also React. So you can use NativeScript with different frameworks. It supports, I don't know, where can I find it? It supports a broad variety of frameworks, and it definitely supports Angular. And if I recall that correctly, it also supports Vue. I'm just wondering, where can I see that? Vue, usage with Vue. Yeah, you can use it with Angular, you can use it with Vue. And with NativeScript, just as with React Native, you get a real native application. Let's actually give it 2 pluses. Well, yeah, 1 or 2 pluses, I don't know. So you get a real native application. So just as with React Native, your components are rendered to actual UI elements for the devices on which the app runs. Of course, there also is Ionic. Oh, and I should mention why I think NativeScript is amazing, because they've been around for so long and they never got the love React Native gets. So NativeScript always had way less usage, and it feels like it's always forgotten when people talk about building native mobile applications, but it's there. It's been there forever, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty good. But yeah, and it's just amazing that it's still there, that it's still well maintained and supported, and that's just amazing. Now, of course, there also is Ionic, and Ionic is maybe a bit. It's interesting. Ionic is also well maintained, but no, I don't want to log in. I want to take a look at the docs. Ionic is also well maintained, but it has seen some difficult years, I think you could say, because Ionic was super popular in 2017 and so on. And back then, the discussion always was React Native or Ionic. And Ionic does not compile to native components. Instead, it's a web view wrapper. So it gives you a mobile app in which your web app is running in a wrapper, so to say. And that brings certain disadvantages regarding performance, regarding native look and feel, even though the Ionic team really did great work in building components that feel native. But for, I think, that reason, React Native always kind of won when comparing the two for many people. And I think Ionic was kind of sold or transitioned to a different company over the years. And yeah, it's there though. It's an option, just a less popular one, I guess, just like NativeScript for Angular and Vue. And therefore, long story short, when you want to build mobile apps, I think that's a bit easier to do with React because there's so much excitement around React Native. AI is really good at React Native. You'll find plenty of resources, plenty of third-party libraries, a vibrant, active ecosystem. And for all these reasons, building mobile apps is definitely easier, I would say, these days with React. Okay. I'll get back to the security in a second. Let me just catch up with the chat. Is Flutter and Dart dead? No. Absolutely not. Performance, obviously, yep. Should include performance here as well. Let's talk about that. Bundle size. Yeah, I talked about bundle size before a bit. Yeah, I can get back to that. It's kind of linked to performance, I guess. So let's gather that as a next topic. Is there some modern way to build those 3 web frameworks into native apps for mobile and PC? So I just talked about mobile, obviously. For PC, good question. I don't know with 100% certainty because it's not something I ever looked into. I know that for React Native, there is this React Native for Windows thing by Microsoft, and I think they also have React Native for Mac OS, also by Microsoft, interestingly enough. So there are these initiatives which I think are under very active development. Yeah. So it's already possible. From what I understand, it's a bit clunky and you'll probably run into difficulties, but it is possible to build desktop applications with React Native. I'm not sure about Angular and Vue if there are equivalents for that. How did we manage state with JavaScript or jQuery before the big 3 frameworks? Yeah, like many of the things, that was definitely more difficult or required more manual work. You would build your own object where you track state, for example, basically your own state managing mechanism. It was way more imperative, so that nice automatic flow which you get with use state, where something updates automatically when you change the state, you had to build that on your own, or write imperative code where you said, okay, I'm going to save that user input in that variable, and then I'm going to go to a certain element and update it. That's how you do it with vanilla JavaScript script. Can you explain what you will use each framework library for? You could really use them for everything. Now, I think, no, it's not. I almost said that Angular maybe is a bit better for more complex applications, not because the others are bad at it, but because Angular can be a bit overkill for simple applications. But to be honest, that changed in the last few years. Like 6 years ago, I definitely would have said, if you're building a super simple application, you might not need a framework at all. But if you do pick one, Angular might be a bit overkill. But I feel like this is not really the case nowadays anymore. So to be honest, you could really build anything with all 3. The biggest reason for reaching for React might be that it's the most popular one. You'll find most resources, most third-party libraries for it. But other than that, really can't say that I would pick one over the other for a strong reason. Lots of SQLite type. Yeah, SQLite is pretty good, I will say. And I'm pretty happy that it's seeing more love now. What else? DynamoDB as a database. Yeah, that's also pretty popular. True. Okay. Isn't Next.js too tightly coupled with Vercel? You could make that argument for sure. Got better though. Deployment outside of Vercel get better. There are better docs on that now, for example. I would say switching from Vue to React or vice versa is a lot easier than to or from Angular. Yeah, that's probably a good point regarding the vendor lock-in. Switching from React and Vue may be a bit easier because with Angular, you got that whole class dependency injection stuff you gotta learn. And with React and Vue, the components are a bit simpler to grasp. So that is a good point. What's your thoughts on Vercel GitHub deployment? What do you advise on mobile apps using various technologies? So for mobile apps, I would advise React Native for the reasons I mentioned. Now, regarding deployments, if you want simple deployments, Vercel and Netlify obviously take a lot of work off you, but you're paying for that. If you are willing to learn more about setting up a VPS, setting up a deployment workflow, using Docker maybe, then you can save some money there, but you gotta do more work on your own and you can screw up more things. That is definitely important. Yeah, learning curve is covered by ease of learning, yeah. Don't you think that Angular has the best separation of concerns? I would agree. It has the best separation of concerns by design out of the box. You can get decent separation of concerns with React and Vue too, but you have to actively enforce it yourself. With Angular, Angular kind of pushes you a bit more to correctly separating concerns, though you could pack everything into components there as well. But yeah, I would agree that it has better separation of concerns out of the box. Max, you have some of the best courses on Udemy. Here's to 10 more years. Yeah, thank you so much. That's amazing to hear. I'm happy you're liking the courses. I would love to be around and do streams and videos and courses in 10 years. So yeah, I keep my fingers crossed too. What about Electron.js? Oh man, yeah. Such an obvious thing that I forgot about that. You are 100% right, of course. Electron is the choice for building for building desktop applications. Now I feel really stupid for forgetting that. Yeah, obviously, good that it was mentioned. Electron.js is essentially like Ionic for mobile apps, gives you a web view wrapper, but for desktop applications, there are no super good alternatives, I would say, and Electron is powering so many applications like Slack. I think even Microsoft Teams. So yeah, Electron.js is the way to go for desktop applications. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I don't recommend Ionic for mobile development. I don't say that I don't recommend it. I just think it has seen better days or more love, more hype around it. That's what I'm saying. Ultimately, I always recommend give different approaches or technologies a chance, try it out yourself, build a very basic prototype and see if it works for you, if it gives you what you want it to give you, and then go with that. There is not that single best choice you have to use. And just because someone else tells you React Native is the best and you have to use that does not mean that that is true. And Ionic is, of course, also getting used by companies out there for their apps and applications, and it clearly works for them. So, yeah. So let's dive into security. Yeah. No, Electron is not dead. I just forgot about it. And thankfully it was pointed out to me that it exists. And yeah, I think Angular to some degree is easier to learn than React, and I explained why before. And the stream will stay on then once it's done, so yeah, you can skip through it to see why I made that point. Tori, also interesting alternative, Rust-based alternative to Electron. I don't think it's going to replace Electron because Electron is so established and popular, even though I forgot about it, but yeah. It's definitely the default choice for building desktop applications if you want to use a web tech stack. So I think Tori will continue to thrive and grow, but I think Electron is not going anywhere. I have a question. When someone knows all the basics and wants to build a solo project, are there real benefits for those libraries and frameworks and that big mess of versions and changes all the time? I think if you want to build a project, a solo project, if it's not super trivial, you will very likely benefit from using a framework, because building it all on your own with vanilla JavaScript will probably not be better than managing versions. And I'm not sure. I sometimes feel like there is a lot of bad reputation attached to some of these frameworks and how they do updates. Especially Angular got a lot of hate a couple of years ago. But in the end, Angular gets 2 versions every year. React got no new major version last year, I should say. Angular gets 2 new major versions every year. And Vue had the last major update 5.5 years ago, I think now. So there aren't that many updates. Obviously, there are lots of smaller changes, and obviously you want to kind of stay updated with those, also for security reasons, and I'll get back to security. But that's really just one command you need to run from time to time. It's not like you need to throw out the existing app and change everything all the time. And also not with those major updates by Angular. It sounds like it totally changes twice a year, but Angular has been super backwards compatible and extremely stable for the last 10 years. And yeah, there have been breaking changes. You don't need to update to the next major version then immediately. You get security patches for older versions as well. They have a long-term stability, long-term support policy. So you don't need to update all the time, and you definitely don't need to change your code all the time. TypeScript support is also a good point, yeah. TypeScript, yeah. Okay, yeah, TypeScript. Let's do TypeScript and then really dive into security and performance. TypeScript is an easy one. I would say Angular, and I'm talking about Angular 2, and the later versions, of course, had awesome TypeScript support from day one, because it was actually the first of these frameworks that relied only on TypeScript. And I know back then when Angular 2 was released, that was quite controversial, and there were people that were not happy about Angular not really supporting vanilla JavaScript that well. They initially kind of did support it, but it wasn't amazing. So yeah, they had great TypeScript support from day one. React, I think, still uses Flow internally, but of course using React with TypeScript is a no-brainer these days too, with Vite and also Webpack projects, of course. So yeah, you can really use TypeScript with React without problems. And the same is true for Vue. Vue 3 was also rewritten in TypeScript, if I'm not totally wrong. It has amazing TypeScript support, so that's a simple one. All 3, in my experience, have great TypeScript support. Also, the surrounding packages from the ecosystem. And yeah, therefore they're stat. Now, regarding security, depends on how you define security. All 3, for example, have built-in cross-site scripting attack support, prevention. So that if you output something user-generated with their default output mechanism, like the curly braces in React or the double curly braces in Angular, you have out-of-the-box protection against cross-site scripting attacks. So that content that you output here, even if it's user-generated, will not be executed, will not be rendered as HTML. If you use what's it called, dangerously render HTML, or I always forget what it's called, but you can get React to output something as HTML, and the same is true for Angular and Vue. Then of course you have that problem again, but you got protection like this. But of course that's not all, and React especially saw some big vulnerability problems in the last weeks. Right, we all know about that, and for React that was related to React server components. So I don't know how to best categorize that, because of course you could say they're all secure, but Angular and Vue are more secure. And I think that would be very wrong to say. Because if we're just looking at React, Angular, and Vue, so just at the client-side libraries, those vulnerabilities that were published wouldn't have been a problem, because they were related to server components. And yeah, that is part of React, true. But you can really only use that if you're using a framework that supports server components like Next.js. So it's a combination of React and Next.js, or some other framework that supports server components like React Router, for example, also does. So yeah, we have those vulnerabilities, but I think you could also find vulnerabilities related to those other meta frameworks or certain features. There just might be less of a spotlight on them. But I will also say, of course, those vulnerabilities are also related to React kind of inventing its own protocol around transmitting data between client and server with server components and server functions. So I just don't want to give the impression that using React is a security issue per se. Because as long as you build web applications, you will always have to deal with security problems one way or the other. And that's not really just because you're using React or anything like that. And if anything, as I said, yeah, it has some complexity the others maybe don't have, but it also has more visibility to some degree. So I have a hard time judging this. And you could, of course, also make the argument that as a framework or as a library maintained by Meta, if there is one of those, or together with Angular, you can definitely rely on any security vulnerabilities that will be detected to be fixed quickly. And I'm not saying, just because that's important to me, that for Vue that wouldn't be the case. I'm just saying here we got Meta and Google behind these frameworks. So you can be sure that vulnerabilities will probably be fixed super, super fast. And for Vue, maybe super fast. I don't know, but maybe also super, super fast, right? But I guess you get my point. So yeah, you will always be able to find security vulnerabilities if something's complex, if something's getting used a lot. So I'm not sure. Yeah. React definitely had some problems here. That's fair to say, I guess. And yeah, there's a good point in the chat. I mean, with React being more popular, of course, there are more people trying to find vulnerabilities and exploit them because the attack surface is bigger. There are more targets, more companies, more sites that are using it. So there is that. Yeah. Okay, so let's see what else can we have, or what do we have here? Yeah, Vue 3 releases really a long time ago. I also feel old. I mean, can you believe? I know Vue 3 was released a couple of months after the pandemic started, or something like that. I think that's really a long time ago now already. Whilst Angular and Vue introduce significant changes in major updates, React just adds more hooks to fix its weak spots. Not saying this is entirely wrong, not saying it's entirely wrong. React definitely gathered some complexity over the last years. Yeah, the React classic dangerously set inner HTML and do not use or you will be fired. Experimental create root containers. Yep, I remember those. Yeah, okay. So yeah, let's talk performance then. Just like security, a bit hard to really say something about that, because well, we can actually, we have that good old JavaScript framework benchmark thing, right? That was a big thing around 2018, but we still have it. That's huge. Okay, so this is in the end a repository, a project you could say, that measures performance of popular or of all kinds of frameworks. Now let's say What's faster? Let's go for Angular. Which one do I need? This one here with signals, let's say. We want to include React, of course. React with hooks. We want to include Vue, of course. So that would be Vue. Yeah, sure. Let's use the latest version here. We can also include Vapor mode, which is a different. I think that was the more effective or the faster updating mode. So we can include that for good measure. Yeah, let's include all those frameworks. Yeah, okay. So now that's way simpler. So okay, so what this project or this framework does is it runs a bunch of different simulations or tests with those different frameworks and measures how long they take for certain tasks. Signals plus no zone, that's a good point, yeah. Angular signals, no zone, yep, we should add that. Good point. Okay, so that's what we have here. And of course, green is good, red is not so good. And you can see we get tests like creating 1,000 rows or replacing 1,000 rows and selecting and updating and swapping rows and all kinds of stuff. Now you can see here the bundle sizes are all in the red, but we can see differences, of course. And especially React is quite heavy these days. But then again, of course, the compressed sizes typically matter, and yeah, that is all definitely acceptable, I would say. Now, what you can see is that Vue with Vapor mode, and Vue Vapor mode, I want to make sure I don't get that wrong. Vapor mode is a different way of Vue updating the DOM. I'm actually not sure, and I don't want to say anything that's wrong, if they're switching away from the virtual DOM here. I think it is the case for Vapor mode. The pitfalls of VDOM, Vapor mode was created to fix this. Okay, so that is then not a virtual DOM. So that's a more effective way of updating the DOM. And we can see that is really fast. So that's super green, best performance of all. Now, with that benchmark, it's always important to keep in mind that's all made up scenarios and very likely, or it's very possible, scenarios that might just not occur on the application you're building. And in that case, it doesn't matter. I mean, if swapping 2 rows for a table with 1,000 rows does not occur like this in your application, it might not matter that React has the worst performance here in this benchmark. That's really important to keep in mind. Not all scenarios might matter for you, and for example, if you're having a table with 1,000 rows, you might think of virtualization anyway, so that you don't render all the rows all the time. But there's that. But you can see Vue Vapor mode is super, super fast, and Vue in general, even without the Vapor mode, is doing very, very well. With React, we got this one very bad test run here or check here. Simulation is the word I was searching for. And Angular has worse performance, but overall acceptable. But of course, if you look just at this, the clear choice is Vue, right? That's an easy choice if you just want to use the framework that does the best here. But you should always take those benchmark results with a grain of salt. Now, regarding the bundle sizes, first paint, got a similar picture. Vue is doing better here, is smaller than Angular, and React especially has a huge bundle. So yeah, that is also something that could matter depending on what you're building. But then again, it might also not matter. Are we back in 2018? Yeah, kind of we are, I guess, doing a good old comparison here. But from looking at this benchmark, it's probably fair to give Vue 3 pluses and then maybe 2 pluses or 1 plus or whatever you want for React and Angular, you could say. React has done a lot in the last couple of years to improve perceived performance, you could say. So that they, for example, defer certain state updates and certain UI updates so that for the user, certain tasks or actions feel faster. React has done a lot there in this area of perceived performance. And that has added to the complexity of React to some degree. React also has the React compiler, which of course they had to introduce kind of to take the burden of wrapping everything into use memo or use callback, which are some performance optimization hooks React offers, off you. So they've done a lot there, but the price for that has been extra complexity that has been added. And of course, it's therefore easy to use some of these tools incorrectly or, but the perceived performance in React applications might be better than what you see in a benchmark. That's essentially the point I'm trying to make here. So, as I said, kind of hard to really order this. And as I also said, it will always matter on what you build. And no matter what you build, you want to think of optimizing performance. As I said, you don't want to render like 1,000 rows necessarily. You want to think of virtualization. You want to think about code splitting. So that will not decrease the size of the library bundle, but it will decrease the overall application bundle. If you split your code, if you only load code that belongs to a certain route when that route is visited. And all three frameworks give you tools for that. For example, Angular has a relatively new feature. I mean, it exists for 2 years now, so not that new, but it has some nice syntax that makes it really convenient and easy to split code and render some fallback content until some bundle has been loaded or some component has been loaded. And you can do the same with React and Vue. They also give you tools for that. And these are all the things you as a developer need to use. So then we could talk about how easy is it to use these tools. And it might be easiest with Angular now, with this defer syntax I just showed you. Vue also not that hard. But if you know how to do it, none of them is hard. So yeah, that's why I would say you can have great performance with all three. You can have bad performance with all three, but out of the box, just from the numbers, Vue is probably a bit better. Lots of talking for a lot of equality, I guess, but it is what it is. And regarding is it server or client performance? Good question. That's client performance. So the benchmark I showed you is client performance. And all my points here are primarily about client side performance. Because server side performance depends on a lot of things, of course, depends on which server side framework and runtime are you using. Is it Next.js with Node? Is it Next.js with Bun? Is it something else? It depends on your server, of course. So on the hardware you're using. Lots of things. I mean, performance is such a complex topic. We can definitely also talk about caching. And their Next.js, for example, can help you with some relatively aggressive caching, which got a bit less aggressive over the years, but it can definitely help with that. You don't have an equivalent to that. Oh, I'm not sure if you have an equivalent to that in Analog and Next, but caching doesn't stop at component level caching. We can talk about image caching and all that stuff. So performance is a super complex topic. The core frameworks, however, I would say have the performance we see here, have their bundle sizes, and have certain tools they give you out of the box to help with reducing the overall bundle size and optimizing the performance, avoiding unnecessary re-renders, and so on. And they all give you tools for that. The main security problem is that Angular, Vue rely mostly on their own ecosystem libs, while React depends on third-party libraries and has almost none of its own. This is a good point regarding the security. As I also mentioned before, with the batteries included, Angular and Vue have more stuff included, and there's less so for React. So of course, if there is some vulnerability related to, let's say, React Router, you have to trust that the React Router team reacts quickly. Whereas with Angular, which has its own router, if there is a routing specific vulnerability, let's say, it's the Angular team, it's Google in the end. So you can kind of trust that the reaction time is as fast as it would be for any other part of Angular. So that's a good point. What's your opinion on implementing server-side rendering for dynamic React pages using a custom Node.js solution rather than a framework? The last time I implemented server-side rendering from the ground up with React and my own Node backend was 1.5 years ago, and it wasn't super difficult, but it's definitely not as easy, obviously, I guess, as if you were using Next.js. But the documentation is okay-ish. You'll find enough resources. AI can help you with that. So it's absolutely doable, but it's definitely way more work. Yeah, so you have to really be open to getting into that and be interested in it, I would say. If you want to set up server-side rendering from the ground up with React. I found Vue because of you in 2017. That's awesome. That's so long ago. Wow, that's really, really amazing. We're all getting old. What about Million.js? Million.js is also pretty interesting. I also cover it in my React course. Million.js, excuse me. Million.js is in the end also a tool, a compiler, you could say, which you can add to your React project, let it run over React code, and it optimizes or it transforms that code to be more performant, to put it in simple terms. So I'm actually not sure how much it's getting used out there in the wild, and I have definitely not used it in any bigger application. Mostly because I don't want to break anything or shoot myself in the foot where maybe down later the road I have problems adding certain libraries or using certain features or updating, but that might just be a wrong perception. It's definitely an interesting project that probably is just a bit too much under the perception level of the React community, myself included, as you can clearly see. It's a good point. I should test it more on bigger apps and not rely just on the React compiler and so on. Do I have a plan for a microservices Golang or Node.js course? No, not really, because I'm not a microservices expert. So a full course on that is not really something where I'm the best person to teach it, I guess. Next.js does image optimization. Do Angular and Vue have that? Good question. Not sure. Does analog.js? I mean, Angular itself does not have it. React itself also does not have it. But no, this is something else. I don't think analog has it. And Nuxt has Nuxt image, automatic image optimization. So Nuxt has it. Yeah. Do you think creating short videos about coding on X or LinkedIn could help attract clients who might give you jobs, since getting freelance work is hard? I think anything that makes you kind of stand out of the crowd and gives you attention, as long as it's positive content, positive attention, can be worth a shot, because there's not a lot to lose. starting a YouTube channel, creating videos, no matter on which platform, writing interesting posts that are not 100% written by AI. All that can make you stand out and can help you get attention and jobs. So yeah, I think anything like that is a good idea. Vue's pushing the industry. Also, they updated their site in a nice way. Vue got the year, didn't it? So Vue has always been super innovative, especially in like 2017 to 20 with all the movement to Vue free and the signal stuff they added there, and now with Vapor mode coming up. And obviously Vite is also by the creator of Vue, which is not directly related, but still. So yeah, lots of innovation, and I like Vue a lot. And it's a great framework. And all these are great frameworks. And I know that's the boring part. Everybody wants to hear that there is a clear winner, but there just isn't. They're all really great and good choices. What are batteries in this context? Well, I mean that in a very general way. I mean, what's included in the framework itself. And I talked about this before. Again, you can skip to the part once the stream is done. It will stay online. But I mean stuff like built-in routing, built-in state management libraries, built-in HTTP clients. Stuff like that is batteries included. And React itself relies way more on the ecosystem than Angular does or Vue does, for example. Why don't you have a classic computer science degree? No, I did not study Wirtschaftsinformatik. I studied business administration, so something totally else. I don't have a computer science degree because I started programming out of interest at the age of 12 or so and never lost that interest. But I didn't want to study it because I always felt like I'm already doing that. I want to study something else. So that was the main reason. I didn't think of it from a career perspective, but simply from a what do I find interesting perspective. And then after studying business administration, I started working in consultancies in a bank, and I felt like, no, that's not really what I want to do. I'll go back to programming. I'll work as a freelancer, and that is what I did. And then I also started creating courses and YouTube and stuff like that. And now I'm here. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm still doing. Coming from Angular, should I spend time learning React alone before diving into Next, or can I just start with Next? You can probably start with Next, but I would recommend learning the React essentials first. And with essentials, I really mean the essentials. I mean understanding how components work, how state works, props work, how to build a very basic single-page application, and then I would move on to Next, because that also helps you then differentiate what's a Next feature, what's a React feature, which I find important. To have a general understanding of what you're working with. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning of the stream, especially nowadays with AI, I think it's super important to have a good understanding of what you're working with and not just trust AI and not really understand the code. I think it's more important than ever to have a good understanding of the code. And that also is, by the way, what can set you apart from other people competing for jobs or whatever it is you're interested in. So yeah, I would definitely learn React first. You don't have to learn everything and build super complex apps, but I would pick it up first. We didn't talk about CSS scoping. In Vue and Angular, it's easy, and for React, it's a disaster. Good point. Good point. Very good point. So in Angular, Angular, like Vue, has built-in support for styling components and for scoping those styles to a component, which means, for example, in Angular, you can link a CSS file to a component like this, and you can also link multiple files to a single component if you want to. And then the styles in that file will be scoped to that component, which means even if you were to use a class name from this CSS file in another CSS file, it wouldn't clash. those styles wouldn't like fight against each other because the styles are scoped, because behind the scenes the class names are changed or linked to an attribute name that's added automatically. And Vue has a similar feature. So Vue also has class and style bindings, and it also has scoping. Scoped style. Yeah, we have, where is it? Scoped CSS. So when building a Vue component, which looks like this, you can add scoped to make sure that a class defined in here is kind of changed behind the scenes to be unique. And if you then have the same class name in another component, they won't clash. So we have built-in support for that in Angular and Vue. And for React, we don't have that. With React and Vite, you can, of course, use CSS modules to achieve the same, though. So Vite, of course, is a very popular build tool in the end that supports all kinds of frameworks, including React. And it has support for CSS modules, which in the end gives you exactly that scoping. The idea is that if you import a CSS file that's named .module.css like that, then this class name you're using, like red in this example, is also transformed behind the scenes, and it's ensured that it's unique, but it's not built into React. So that's a good point. I know Angular. Should I learn React or Vue? I mean, that's generally a good question. How easy is it maybe to switch from one to another? And I think my opinion is if you know one of them, switching is fairly simple. So they all have the same idea behind you. You have components, you have state, you have props, and so on. Now, as was brought up in a couple of minutes ago or so, maybe it's a bit easier to switch from Vue to React and vice versa, because Angular has that whole thing about classes and dependency injection, but in the end, it's about the same core concept. So switching is possible. Now, when it comes to the question, which I now forgot. Where is it? Should I learn React or Vue? When you know Angular, whatever you like more. React, of course, is more popular, has more usage, has more jobs, most likely, depending on where you live, but probably in most areas in the world. So switching or learning React in addition to Angular is probably the better idea if that is important. If you want to build your own projects, then I would give both a try and go with whichever one you like more. You can learn the basics in a day or so, and then just dive deeper into the one you enjoy more. That would be my recommendation. Never knew you started as a freelancer. Would be an interesting topic to share your thoughts on how to become an effective one, especially in the age of AI. Of course, I started before the age of AI. I started in 2015 and worked as a freelancer from there on. And nowadays, of course, things are very different. I don't take a lot of clients anymore, actually no new clients at all, and do very little freelance work. And I'm not looking for new clients, so that changed. So I'm not sure how much I can contribute for the current situation, unfortunately. That's why I don't really share a lot about that, because that feels like I'm talking about something I have no idea about, because starting as a freelancer in 2015 was, of course, very different from how it's today. I can say, of course, that I got most of my initial clients not through Upwork or sites like this, but really I went to local businesses in my area and asked, hey, do you need a better website maybe? And showed them what's maybe not so good about their current site, and then built my network through that. So that's essentially how I got started back then. Did you suffer from shiny object syndrome as a developer? For example, I would feel like switching to Angular just you mentioned something cool about it. How do you stop this loop? I mean, that is always the danger as a developer. We probably all suffer from shiny object syndrome. I think it's a way of kind of running away from actually doing the work, depending on what your work is. If you want to build a project, it can be kind of seductive to switch to a different framework because maybe you can build your project better with that. And I think you have to kind of resist that temptation and maybe just dive into the shiny stuff from time to time. For example, I have my personal rule that Friday is my fun day. So on every Friday, I try to try something new, dive into something new, and not with the goal of using it as my main thing or to build any big project with it, but just because I enjoy learning new stuff or exploring new stuff. So because shiny object syndrome can definitely be a problem. What were your main resources for learning programming when you decided to pursue that career path? So back when I started at the age of 12, it was books, and I would inspect the source code of websites and work my way from that. And then over the years, of course, obviously the internet became a thing, and I've always been a fan of official documentation. I always dive into official docs. To this day, I dive into official docs and learn a lot from that. And then by building stuff, by building demo projects, trying to build more and more complex projects. And that is how I grow or try to grow and try to tackle the more difficult parts and learn the more difficult parts. Any tips for learning Vue fast-pass, as I've been working with React.js for Next.js since 4 years? Since you got a lot of experience with frameworks or libraries already, I would just take some project you maybe already built with React and try rebuilding it with Vue, and do that with help of the documentation and with help of AI. But just primarily to ask questions and not let AI write too much code. And I think that is a good way of learning it quickly. If you were to start over and learn web dev from scratch, how would you go about it? I would briefly dive into the bare fundamentals like HTML, JavaScript, CSS. I would still do that, build some basic dummy sites with that so that I understand how that works, what the core building blocks there are, what the core philosophies are, and then I would pick up a framework or library, probably React if my goal was to get a job, just because of the sheer usage and because, as I mentioned, switching is always possible once you learned one of them. Maybe I would also use Vue because it's just simpler to get the hang of it. But yeah, I would quickly switch to a framework. I would probably try out different ones and then switch to one and then start building projects as soon as possible, because that's the best way to grow. Brief description about the difference of Vite and Next.js. Totally different thing. Next.js is a full stack framework which you can use to build full stack React applications. It gives you server-side routing, gives you server-side data fetching and stuff like that. Vite is in its essence a build tool. It's a tool that you can use for creating projects, for building those projects, so for preparing them for deployment, for optimizing them, for integrating other tools into the build process. It's not a framework that gives you a full stack app like Next.js does. Yeah, AI programming tools definitely heavily favor React. And I said it at the beginning of the stream, I heard, not sure if it's true, but I heard that many AI tools have in their system prompt instructions to use React. And obviously there has been lots of training data on React. So yeah, absolutely. React is AI's favorite. I'm a mid-level front-end developer with a solid grasp of the basics, but I haven't used any framework. Which one should I start with? Yeah, basically what I just said. Vue is probably the simplest one to pick up. React has the most usage. I would take a brief look at all of them, maybe a day or so, play around with them, go with the one you like the most. Because switching will be easier once you learn one of them. Which IDE am I using? Mostly Cursor, also Claude Code a lot. I switch or combine them a lot. Also because since I also create courses, I want to stay up to date and see what changes, how they behave, and so on. Okay. I know React. Is it worth learning Angular or Vue? Yeah, basically what I said before. I think it's always worth diving into other frameworks as well. If you do it just for the joy of it, that is totally fine. I can only recommend it. I like doing that myself. But if it's for getting a job or something like this, I think it's not necessary, but it will definitely like give you a broader horizon and grow your skill set if you also understand how certain problems are tackled by another framework. So never a bad idea to learn more, I would say. Yeah, never a bad idea to learn more. Do you think being good at math helps a lot in the career? It definitely doesn't hurt, but I think for web development specifically, it's also not super important. I think it's very different for game development, for example. But yeah, it won't hurt, but it's not super important to be good at math, I would say. Thinking logically, however, is super important, and of course, that kind of is linked. I guess there are people that can think very, very well logically and still are not great at math, but people that are good at math often, typically, can think very logically, and that, of course, will always help with programming. Why did not include tan-stack query in state management? Well, I could make that list grow all the way to the right. You gotta make a point somewhere. And tan-stack query, whilst it can help with state management, is more a data fetching library, of course. So it's not the obvious thing for me to include here. But yeah, I could add more and more libraries here. So don't take this as the only final ultimate analysis. It's just my opinion. You saw me discuss all these things. This is not the ultimate truth here. Okay, so I gotta go. Time flies by. Was another fun stream. I'm sorry if I missed your question. I did my best to answer as many as possible, but impossible to answer them all. Thank you all so much for the nice comments, the questions, the participation. I will probably stream again next Thursday. Let me check my calendar. Yes, I will. So yeah, join me next Thursday again if you want to. And yeah, thank you all for joining my courses, for all the nice feedback. I read it all, so even if I did not explicitly mention it, I read all the chat messages, tried my best to answer. So yeah, I hope you'll have a great day, evening, morning, whatever it is for you. Thanks for joining, and maybe see you next week. So bye bye.